Well, on the week that was supposed to be the winter meetings, it turns out that there's no winter meetings, but we're as busy as we thought we would be. On this podcast alone, we will talk Trevor May, George Springer, Trevor Bauer, Jake Odorizzi, James McCann, JT Realmuto, Zack Wheeler. Is it 2019 again? Shea Anything starts now. Hey, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Shea Anything podcast. It's Doug Williams and Andy Martino with you. A reminder to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify. And it's a big week, as I said off the top. This was supposed to be the winter meetings, not really happening virtually. Andy will get into that in a second. But that doesn't change anything on our airwaves because on SNY, we have BNNY weekdays at 6 as usual. But Mets Hot Stove, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 6:30 each day this week. All three nights at 6:30. Trevor May will join Monday's show. Andy Martino also on Monday's show, I believe.
That's me.
Are you on all three?
I'm on Monday and Wednesday, and then there are some wonderful baseball luminaries on the other shows. So we got a great week. It's like there's some winter meetings that are very slow, and nothing really happens. This week, stuff could happen. So virtual, non-virtual, as you're saying, Doug, there could still be news and we will still have the programming. Although the one thing I'll miss is those long Facebook Lives with Steve. Those are always fun in the middle of the day at the winter meeting. I mean, those are fun.
Those always get kind of weird. And sometimes
a little loopy.
Sometimes I ask questions on the SNY like live feed. Jeremy Hafner's also joining Wednesday's show, and he's a really interesting guest for Mets fans. He joined us during the living room edition of Baseball Night in New York when we were shut down. So I guess, Andy, let's start with what I kind of teased. The week that this is, do you expect, we're taping this on Monday, do you expect that even though maybe some league business is being done virtually, even though there's no winter meetings, that this podcast will be very dated in a couple days' time? Like, are the Mets going to sign somebody before our next episode?
It's always tough to predict timing, Doug, but I can say that they're working on stuff. And when you're working on stuff, ultimately something can land. As I reported late last week, there's a slowness to this hot stove season, especially like the starting pitching market. Guys like Kluber, Jose Quintana, not necessarily expected to move super fast. But the Mets are actually perceived to be out ahead of stuff. Like, they're the team that's like, we're not waiting on the market to set itself. We're going to identify targets and just get them if we can get them, like they did with Trevor May. Could you have gotten a cheaper alternative to May that was a non-tender who was like 75% as good? Maybe, but, screw it. Let's get Trevor May. That's kind of Sandy Alderson's mentality right now, backed by Steve Cohen's money and hunger. So the Mets could do – if you told me in the next 5 minutes that they signed a Springer, a Jake Odorizzi, or a James McCann, I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, they've been working on that stuff. I'm not saying they're getting those guys, but – they're enough in the mix where they could.
Do you think that strategy of Sandy and Steve Cohen is a 1-year thing because they're capitalizing on a market, or do you think that they are going to adopt the kind of Brave strategy? That's the team I associate with not waiting for a market and signing whoever they want early, like they did with Morton. Do you think that that's going to be a thing for years to come?
That's a good question. I think it depends who the GM is going to be. I hate to sound like a broken record on that, but I don't think Alderson plans on being as active with agents next year as he's being right now. Should have a GM in place certainly by next offseason. And that's the person he would like to kind of mentor to take this thing over long term. So we'll see who that person is and how they operate. I agree with you. Alex Anthopoulos is a GM who's just like, it's targeted. It's like, here's what I want. Let's do it. Sometimes you overpay, but at least you get what you want. I don't know if the Mets will be like that long term. This winter is obviously very unique for them. And so I know that I guess time will tell on the long-term strategy. That's not been Alderson's MO for a long time. So I would be surprised if he was like that forever. In fact, he's a guy who agents sometimes get frustrated with for having a slow, deliberate pace, like into January and February. That's just not really how he's acting right now, but it's how he's acted a lot in the past.
So you said that before we get into the players, and we will in just a second, you said that they hope to have a GM in place by next offseason.
Or the offseason after. I mean, whatever works.
So what is that? I know you just wrote a column about this for SNY.TV, and I read it, and there's some personal stuff on that from you about your reporting on this. The clip that went viral from Baseball Night in New York, which, by the way, was you reusing a point that we talked about on the podcast last week, and it just goes to show you that all that matters is what's clipped off and put on Twitter these days. But anyway, so this job, is it that people don't want it? Is that kind of the point you're making, that like someone should take a risk, just take it?
Well, I might need to revise if my point wasn't clear to an early reader of the column.
Well, no, it's I'm only one person, Andy. I want you to explain the point to the rest of the listeners.
I would say that enough people haven't wanted it where it's like, what's going on here? And I know part of what's going on here. I've reported on it. Haven't offered an opinion on it until today, despite what some people think. As you know, on that show last week, we were kind of in the middle of a discussion about like, here's how people think, and it got clipped off as my opinion. Today's column is actually the first time I've offered one, and it's the complete opposite, I think, of what people seem to think my opinion was. But I think someone should take a risk. I don't think it's hard to judge individuals, but I think I know that there's a general mentality in the game right now, which is like understandable on a human level, but also part of a cultural problem in the game, which is, I'll make up a fictitious assistant GM in a mid-market. Let's say the Springfield Isotopes, the Simpsons' favorite team. So we won't make this about anyone in particular. You're the GM of that, or the assistant GM of that team. You're like, I make a pretty good salary. I have a nice big house. I'm not going to get fired if we don't win the World Series. And I could just work here for a long, long time. Then Sandy Alderson's putting out feelers. You want to come work here? More money. You got to move here, though. Owner who explicitly wants to win the World Series in 3 to 5 years. You might be a legend, but it might all not work, and maybe you're out of a job. It's just sort of like the mentality of you only live once versus like slow and steady wins the race, and everyone's different. I love the school my kid is in. My wife doesn't want to move. My husband doesn't want. All that stuff factors in, but there's a broader industry trend that's risk averse right now. It's the same reason why veteran GMs like Brian Cashman don't make the same kinds of splashy trades they used to make, because they can't find trading partners. No one wants to make a splash anymore. No one wants to like go all in and try to win the World Series as much as they used to. Now it's like, let's just contend every year. Let's just be okay. Let's just build an 80-win team and not take big risks and see what happens. That's the way the industry's going. And I think what the Mets are running up against is that individuals who were raised in that industry are now taking that risk aversion in a personal way and saying, yeah, I could try for that Mets job, but I don't know. I'm pretty happy here with the Springfield Isotopes, and I'm not going to get fired. So there's a whole risk averse thing in the business, and that's hurting the Mets a little bit.
Right. And the opinion that you present in the column is somebody take a risk. So let's go through, speaking of splashes, I know you were using that word in a different context, but let's go through what I guess this ties together our first conversation, Andy. The Trevor May signing, we saw he was introduced last week in a very professional Zoom setup. Was that a market setting deal? Do you think that they made that decision knowing that that's kind of going to set the tone for the relief market going forward?
I think it was more that what the Mets and the Braves and a few other teams have done so far in signing free agents is seen by other agents as outlying stuff. Not necessarily.
One-offs.
Yeah, like, hey, they're being aggressive. They're targeting. There are a handful of teams that are. I mean, it's not going to hurt another reliever that May got that kind of money, obviously, is to your question about setting the market. But there's such a glut of right-handed relievers now on the market after the non-tender deadline that I think it's going to be tough for some of them to get good contracts. So Mets could have waited, could have sifted through that pile, and they probably will still sift through that pile. But additionally, it was like, let's just get May. He likes Hefner. Hefner likes him. This is what he'll sign for. Let's just do it. I don't think that it's a Mets thing. I don't think it has that much other, precedent setting relevance.
All right. So George Springer's next. Let's talk about him. And I can't really bring up his name without also bringing up this, wanting to hear your information on this this memo that big league teams have received, which is basically like, prepare to not have the universal DH next year. And that's important to the Springer conversation, because if the Mets don't have the DH next year, shuffles everybody around, and it might put Dom Smith in left field, which puts most likely Brandon Nimmo in center, unless they just decide one of those players is expendable.
Mm-hmm.
Let's sign Springer anyway. So how much do you think that a team like the Mets is waiting on that before they make a move on Springer?
I think it's probably in the soup somewhere, but if you're going after Springer when other teams are on him, like the Blue Jays and I'm sure some others, I don't know that you have the luxury of taking it at that pace. You got to pursue Springer.
And so if you want him, you just got to sign him and then figure out.
Yeah, and you're right about the roster fallout, and it's unfortunate to not know, but they don't know if there's going to be a DH next year. And we might have more clarity on that this week with some industry meetings going on. The memo that you referred to seemed more like, it certainly wasn't definitive. It's more like, here's where it stands right now. Prepare for this, but it could change. We'll see. It's a point of negotiation between the league and the union, and we know those always go smoothly. So we'll see. But I don't know. I don't think that the Mets can be like, we're on Springer if there's no DH, but we're not. I think if you really want to target a free agent, you kind of have to make that the priority, and then deal with the rest of the So if you have to move Nimmo in February to clear a spot in the outfield because there's no DH, then maybe you just do at that time.
God, it just seems to me that like there's so many unknowns going into 2021 that this seems like a very simple thing that we could iron out so that you at least know who's going to be on your team. And
nothing simple between those two sides, as we saw last spring and summer.
Springer specifically, Andy, where do the Mets stand in terms of trying to sign him?
They want him. They're on him, and we'll see. There's been a perception in the industry that he could be the first of the big names to sign. The big names being Springer, Bauer, and Realmuto. Am I forgetting anybody? I don't think so. I think those are the big ones. He could be the first. Mets, Blue Jays, I'm sure others that we haven't heard of. He's represented by Excel, an agency that doesn't do a lot of talking to the media about all the teams that are pursuing a player. So I'm sure there's even more there than we know about, and could drop anytime.
All right, let's go through those big three. Trevor Bauer, any update there with him and the Mets?
Yeah, unless there's something going on that's been completely undetected with any team, it's been pretty quiet with Bauer so far. I'm sure that his agent is working. I'm sure, obviously, teams are calling. But as with other starting pitchers, whether no one's as good as Bauer on the market right now. But you have some guys that are good, like Odorizzi, Tanaka, Paxton, Taiwan Walker, then even all the way down to Rick Porcello, Corey Kluber. There's so many starting pitchers out there, and it's pretty quiet on all of them, I think, or most of them right now, and seems to be quiet on Bauer, unless they're playing it super, super stealth across the board.
What's interesting is the Mets, obviously the conversation with starting pitching starts with Bauer, and then you make your way through, and we'll talk about Odorizzi in just a second too. The Mets need so many, and they don't need the top tier guys, but they need depth and lots of it. So I wonder when that's going to come. Are they going to sign or trade for guys closer to spring training who may end up in AAA and then help out with the big league depth down the line? I don't know. But
let me say, in defense of their depth a little, if they sign Odorizzi, and I know you said we're going to talk about that in a second, but then you've got DeGrom, Odorizzi, Stroman, Peterson, with Syndergaard coming back at some point. That's not bad.
No, I'm not saying that group is bad or that the Mets really need starting pitching help. I'm actually just saying they need depth. Last year we went in with 6 starting pitchers, and we were talking about how, who's going to be the 5 starter? Is Matt's really the odd man out? And it obviously turns out that you need 10, and that was a 60-game season. David Peterson wasn't even really supposed to help out in 2020, and he did, and the Mets are lucky for that. But you need a lot behind those guys. Syndergaard, I'm not really sure you can count on coming off that injury. I think Seth Lugo makes a better reliever. I think Steven Matz is a change of scenery guy. Like, I agree that group could be talented, especially if they sign somebody like Odorizzi, but I just think they need a lot of those depth signings because you can't be back in a situation where Erasmo Ramirez or Walker Lockett, like, you need a tier above those guys for your depth, in my opinion.
Sure. Yeah. That's going to be tough in one off season. They'll bring in some guys and some minor league deals, and sure, for sure. That comes down to developing starting pitching too, which Alderson in his later years as GM and Brody in his last two haven't really left covered particularly full either. So that's an organizational thing they have to focus on. That's I mean, they'll sign. If you remember those early years when Alderson was GM, every year there was a Chris Young or a Chris Capuano or someone coming in, and I'm sure they'll bring in guys like that. I agree with you that they need to, but it all seems like it's just going to happen pretty late.
Before we get into the Odorizzi specifically, let's round out the big three with JT Realmuto. What's the latest with him, Andy?
Well, no question the Mets are more on James McCann than they are on Realmuto, but I wouldn't completely close the door on Realmuto, only because I think it's really unclear what his market is going to be. His agent might beg to differ, but you look around, if it's not going to be the Mets or the Phillies, and I'm not saying it's not going to be the Phillies, but what we're hearing about the Phillies is a period of seeming contraction rather than expansion with their budget. Who's it going to be? I mean, I know he's deserving of a long-term contract, and he's the best catcher in baseball. The Mariners have been mentioned. Well, what I hear about him is that he really wants to win. There's other teams out there, of course, that could use a catcher, but I just think there's a small sliver of a chance that market doesn't develop. And like the whole point of McCann is it's such a smaller contract than Realmuto, but what if it isn't? I'm just saying. So I think the Mets have to be at least kind of like on the fringes of the Realmuto thing, just in case it becomes a more reasonable contract than they think it will be.
And by the way, the one thing about James McCann that trips me up is how little we know about him as a starting catcher in a full season. Mm-hmm. Could he be Tyler Flowers for the rest of his career? Yes. And if Anthony Recker were on this podcast, he would say, yes, that would be great. I mean, he's a good defensive catcher. But from what I am hearing about McCann, Andy, and correct me if I'm wrong, he's going to be paid more than just a defensive sure thing guy who will start and play 120 games, will have a good backup behind him. He's going to get paid like a team who thinks you haven't been rewarded with a starting job yet. Now's your chance.
Yeah, I think he's going to do pretty well. I don't know how well he's going to do. There's been some stuff out there that seems a little exaggerated to me and how well he's going to do. But yeah, we'll see. There's such a dearth of catching. Right, he's not like bargain basement. He's somewhere in between. He's going to get paid decently, whatever it is. There seems to be multiple teams interested, including the Mets. So, yeah, if it gets too crazy, there could be a point where Alderson's like, you're James McCann. You're not Gary Carter. Let's just pump the brakes. Could happen.
Yeah. Just an aside about Realmuto, I think there's some Realmuto fatigue. And I'm using specifically Sal Licata's opinion on this from Baseball Night in New York. He was Mr. JT Realmuto last year. He always wanted Realmuto on the Mets, thought he was a good trade candidate. And now that he's a free agent and he's being talked about a lot, and he's 30, and I feel like there's just like he's not worth all that money. Because he was the hot commodity a couple of years ago, and he was this catcher that maybe not everybody had focused on how great he was. He was underrated. And now that we're talking about him getting a lot of money, it's like it's not the obvious signing that he once was. So
yeah, well, he's 2 years older too.
I know, yeah, that doesn't help.
Yeah, he's still great, and he'll make some team very good or he'll help a team be very good probably for the next several years. So. But you're right. There might be some very Mets fan specific Realmuto fatigue. But
I just
get over it.
you're going to realize if you sign, let's say if the Mets sign him, you'll realize that like he's the reason why, if you equate it to like a car, right? He's like a Porsche Cayenne, and you buy that car, you're like, wow, yeah, this is why this is so expensive.
That was my experience. Yes.
Yeah. Whereas like if you get a reliable but budget SUV in James McCann, you're like, okay, like this is why this was less expensive.
What is Gary Sanchez? What type of car?
I think he's a Range Rover, because I think he's a very like attractive player, like occasionally hits the long home run, but really not reliable at all.
I didn't know that about the Range Rover, but assuming
Range
that's
Rovers
true,
are known.
it's a good
Range
analogy.
Rovers are known as just a terrible investment because they look cool and you drive a Range Rover when you buy one, but they break down like every 5,000 miles.
Well, I agree with you that Realmuto is the Porsche Cayenne. He still is. But again, when Brody was trying to trade for him, he was 27, about to turn 28, 29, about to turn 30, looking for a long-term deal. Hey, time moves on. You know, my body doesn't work as well as it did a few years ago either. So that's just the way it goes. And that's the reality of when he became a free agent too. But yes, he's better, way better than James McCann, like way, way better. You sign him as, I was going to say, if you're the Mets, you sign him as part of a bigger picture where you're saving some resources for a Springer or a Bauer, obviously.
That gets lost. I think so much of this is how involved fans are in the money process of this. Mm-hmm. How much a part of, and I'm putting myself in the category of the fan at home, how much part of our offseason process, just watching all of this, listening to all of this, is about that's not worth that player's not worth that amount of money. This player's worth that amount. Like, we are really focused on that. So when we are, a player like Realmuto becomes less about the player and more about the contract, because we're not watching him play right now. You know, there's no games on. So it becomes so much more about the numbers that we hear. And so when you were talking about the maybe slightly exaggerated, I think 4-year contract that was reported out there for James McCann, when fans hear that, it's like, oh, okay, that goes against the narrative of the fact that like McCann's this like budget guy who, I don't know.
Look, there's a reason. One of the reasons I unfollowed everyone on Twitter is because it's easy to get caught up in this kind of stuff. But like, let's just stick ahead with what we know and what we feel is rational. Because just because someone said that doesn't mean that anyone has to worry that that's going to be true. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm waiting until you follow one person or entity on Twitter and it's like some statement. Like I'm like, maybe you'll follow, I'm trying to think who you would follow. Is it like maybe God? Doesn't God have a Twitter account?
Yes, I believe so. I'm not sure if it's verified, like if it's him or if it's someone
an imposter.
Yeah, like his agent, or I don't know, but it
might be God's agent, God's team. Okay, Odorizzi. Where did things last week? Where were things? Where are things now?
The same factors that got Trevor May to Queens are the factors that could get Odorizzi to Queens. Mets' willingness to pay now, attractiveness of the aggressive new situation under Cohen and Alderson, and a personal relationship with the pitching coach Jeremy Hefner formed in Minnesota. Those are the reasons that May cited. That's the pitch to Odorizzi. And look, there are other teams that want him, but the Mets have a good chance.
And where do you think he would be in that rotation? What is he?
He's good. I mean, if you look, last year he got hit by a comebacker, and then I think he had a blister, and you know, it was just a weird year, obviously, in a lot of ways. But it wasn't as if he had any medicals that were long-term troubling. So if you looked at what he was the year before, he was an all-star. He was a really good pitcher for a really good team in the Twins in 19. And was good the year before as well. So he's an attractive free agent pitcher, quite possibly the most attractive free agent pitcher behind Bauer. So he'd be, I mean, you could talk about him versus Stroman, number 2. It doesn't really matter that much, but he'd be at the top of a rotation.
Yeah. The only thing that matters less about what I know, I just brought it up. You made an interesting point on BNNY last week about about how roles don't matter anymore. It's like it's innings now. It's just like how many innings can you go? It's not.
Yep.
It's like 1 through 3. I guess that's the starter, but it's more just like 3 innings. So the only thing that matters less these days is, are you the 2 starter or the 3 starter? That number just goes away as soon as the season starts.
That's
but
true.
It's good for us for conversations.
And
Zack Wheeler.
On that, by the way, people talk about rotations. The Mets didn't have one last season. I don't mean that as a dig. Like, they legitimately abandoned the idea of a rotation. You remember? Obviously, part of that was by necessity because there were injuries and underperformance. But there were weeks at a time where the Mets didn't have a starter 2-3 days from now. And it wasn't like a crisis. It was like, yeah, we're not doing that. We're doing innings. It's piggyback. It's this, it's that. It's just, they blew up the whole idea of even having one. And I could see it continue to go that way.
Okay, so Zack Wheeler, this was a rumor that really was fascinating. Comes out that the Phillies might be willing to trade him as they're trying to shed salary. I believe that was a Buster Olney report originally. Mm-hmm. So obviously Mets fans took that and ran with it. The Mets need starting pitching. Obviously, this was a Sandy Alderson guy, and maybe that's somebody who he wants to bring back. Then John Middleton comes out and says we would not trade him for Babe Ruth, which
he's dead.
He's not alive anymore. But point taken. Do you think there's any possibility of something like this happening, Andy?
Not anymore. Not after the owner came out with, look, these are sometimes such a war of semantics. I mean, Buster Olney doesn't make stuff up. I'm sure someone had a conversation about something. I'm sure that John Middleton doesn't have any intention of trading Zack Wheeler. I don't know if you noticed, but he also said he wouldn't trade him for Mike Schmidt, which is like the best player in the history of your franchise.
Yeah.
I mean, now he's not going to be good, but would you trade him for prime Mike Schmidt if you had the ability? So there's a lot of questions there with those comments.
But by the way, this is how I should have teed up this conversation, is that you, from working in Philadelphia, still have like boots on the ground in Philadelphia. So you can dig into reports out of Philadelphia. So did you do that?
A little bit. But more importantly than anything I could do, Jim Salisbury, who covers the Phillies as well as anybody covers any team, wrote, he was the one that quoted Middleton initially and team president Andy McPhail strongly denying it. So let's put it this way. If there was a sliver of a chance that they would listen on Zack Wheeler before, well, now they can't because team ownership's on the record saying we won't. So that's that, probably.
So that's that.
I mean, he wasn't going to, if they're going to trade him, they're not trading him to the Mets anyway, obviously.
Yeah.
But,
Any move that you're hearing anything about that we don't necessarily have on our radar right now?
How about Jose Quintana to the Yankees? Oh, this is a Mets podcast. I wasn't being passive aggressive. I really forgot. Mets related. Try to smoke them if I got them, Doug. Let me think if there's anything that I forgot to write. I don't think so. I mean, there's coaching stuff that we haven't touched on. I don't know how interesting that is to people, but Chili Davis is hanging in the balance a little bit, whether he's going to come back or not. That's being decided. We'll see. A lot of players would be probably unhappy if he was let go, but he's under contract, so maybe they ride with him another year. But Alderson's always had a very particular idea of what he thinks a hitting coach should be, and Davis's approach doesn't really match that. So we'll see where that goes. That's one thing. There's going to be a new bench coach. Wouldn't stun me if it was Six, the nickname for Pat Rossler, who's now assistant hitting coach with the Nationals, former Mets hitting coach. Could be someone else, but they're in a bench coach search right now. And also they need a general manager. Have we mentioned that yet?
Well, we haven't talked names yet. Is there anybody we should be?
I mean, look, we're taking this in broad strokes. Obviously, we're way past the phase of big name executives who fans have probably heard of. They're not looking for a president of baseball ops anymore. Obviously, Chris Young would have been a very intriguing hire. That was a real shame, I think, that it didn't work out because Alderson wants to mentor somebody, and that requires a personal connection, a relationship. So that's more than a resume, and it's hard to come by that, obviously. So that was tough. There are a couple of young executives in Arizona. There's Josh Burns, who's been mentioned with the Mets before, who's currently in the mix with the Phillies, could be in the mix. Billy Owens' name was written recently. That was written a while ago. We'll see. It hasn't been front burner earlier. It's just at this point, it's all about the connection you feel with Alderson. And he's continuing to do interviews. So we'll see. It's not probably going to be someone who fans are like immediately like, oh, Theo Epstein. It's going to be like, oh, let me Google this guy. Oh, okay.
It's going to be like Brody Van Wagenen. That sounds familiar.
Well, he does fit a lot of the things that they're looking for.
Who's willing to take a risk and,
I always
he's down with the aggressive rhetoric of his owner.
Hey, it in many ways it would have fit, but was not to be.
It was not to be. All right, good stuff, Andy. Appreciate the updates on all of these guys. You are taking some much needed, much deserved time off. So we'll be talking to you when we talk to you, but it won't be for a couple of weeks. Keith Hernandez is joining us for next week's episodes. That'll be good stuff as always. And maybe we'll have some moves to react to. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. Talk to you next week.